Good morning, good afternoon to wherever you may be. Welcome to the third day of the Atlantic Council Europe Center's Central Europe Week, a series of events on how the United States and Central Europe can together lead in shaping transatlantic responses to global challenges. My name is Ian Brzezinski. I'm a senior fellow at the Council's Europe Center, and I have the privilege of moderating this discussion on the 3 Cs and European energy security. Thus far this week, we've had conversations on the Belarus border crisis and on digitization of the region. Today's conversation is going to build on the themes of building greater transatlantic resilience, focusing on energy and infrastructure development. We convene this afternoon, amidst rising energy prices across Europe, a dynamic driven in large part by Russia's possibly intentional refusal to meet growing energy demand on the continent. And this development has highlighted the energy dimension of the 3 Cs initiative. The 3 Cs initiative is an effort by 12 Central and East European member states to leverage the power of the private market to accelerate the development of cross-border energy, transport, and digital infrastructure in the region between the Baltic, Black, and Adriatic Seas. Strengthening Europe's energy resilience has been the 3 Cs' most prominent dimension. In fact, it's received a commitment from the United States to invest up to $1 billion into 3 Cs energy projects, including a $300 million equity investment into the initiative's 3 Cs fund. And even more recently, the US-Germany MOU on Nord Stream 2 highlights supporting 3 Cs energy projects as a realm for US-German collaboration. To discuss the role of the 3 Cs initiative in strengthening energy resilience in Europe, we have an outstanding panel. Let me introduce Edis Saikans, Deputy State Secretary on Energy Issues at the Ministry of Economy in the Republic of Latvia. He leads the ministry's Department of Energy Market and Infrastructure. And he also serves as the Deputy Chairman of Latvia's distribution network operator for electricity. Latvia, by the way, will be hosting the next 3 Cs Summit and Business Forum in Riga in the summer of 2022. Ambassador Dora Zambori is Ambassador at Large for Energy and Climate at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Hungary. We got to know her as Chargée d'Affaires in Washington. I think that was actually her second tour. She's also been a transatlantic diplomatic fellow at the US Department of State, so she's got a lot of ties in the United States. And her career includes numerous postings in the energy sector, including as the director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Energy Security Unit. Ambassador Dick Morningstar. He's the founding chairman of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. And he's an important leader in the Council's work on the 3 Cs initiative. He served as ambassador to Azerbaijan, as the US ambassador to the European Union, as a US special envoy for Eurasian energy, among numerous other senior level US government posts. In addition to being at the Atlantic Council, he's also been a lecturer at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and also at Stanford Law School. And our fourth panelist, Mr. Brian Kelly, Vice President of Government Affairs at Sempra. Sempra is a North American energy infrastructure company with about $12 billion in annual revenues that focuses on electricity and natural gas. Brian leads Sempra's global public policy and regulatory priorities, and he brings to that 30 years of experience in the business of public policy and government affairs. He's been a founder and leader of BK Strategies, and he's senior director at the US Natural Gas Alliance. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for sharing your time with us this morning. Before we begin with discussion, let me remind our audience to submit their questions via the dedicated question box if they're watching on the Atlantic Council Central Europe Week page, or by commenting on YouTube or Twitter if they're watching it in those vehicles, and those questions will be forwarded to me. So let me start by focusing on the crisis at hand. Gas prices have spiked significantly over the last several months across Europe, also in Central Europe. Many say the spike in gas prices has been due to an intentional decision by Russia to not meet Europe's demand for gas. So Minister Saikans, let me turn to you first. Is Europe facing an energy shortage that was intentionally created by Moscow? And if so, how does this crisis affect the significance and urgency of the energy dimension of the 3 Cs initiative?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here and participate in this debate. It's really important, and particularly currently when we face with such different price volatility in all Europe, across all Europe. Actually, if as an answer to the question about what do we have some problems here with energy supply to Baltic states. I could say that I do not want to call the situation as energy crisis. For us, how we discuss it in our national level, also in regional level, yes, we see that it's a short-term energy price crisis, or maybe we can describe it in a little bit different way. We can describe it as we have going up to risk to increase the poverty of energy poverty here in maybe in region. But actually what we have seen now, and we have all the time in the close discussion with our responsible persons in energy sector, with producers and distribution and transmission system operators on gas and electricity. And what we see now is that currently electricity and all other energy resources are enough. We do not have any problems with supply of them. What we currently face is high prices of them. But if we look from the Latvian perspective or from Baltic region's perspective, it should be also noted that we still, as the Baltic states, are quite island mode operations in gas sector. Actually, we have one major supplier of gas to Baltic states. It's Russia. And of course, we have some alternative sources in LNG terminal here in Lithuania, in our neighbor country. And that means that we have somehow diversified our energy sources and routes as well. And the same is quite similar in electricity, but we are still somehow we are connected with Europe, with Scandinavian countries, but we are still working as I could say as an island mode in Europe, but we are connected with Russian Brel loop. This means that we are still in such a historical synchronous zone with Russia and Belarus. And what we are doing now, I think we are in Latvia stepping ahead with a lot of projects of decades, I could say, in Baltic states. We finally see that in this decade till the 2025, we will become the full member of the European electricity market. We will fully integrate it in the European grids. And as well as in the gas sector, we hope that next year we will be connected to the European continental European grids gas as well. Therefore, overall, if we look on the potential crisis here in Baltic states, I could say that we do not have a lack of energy resources. We have enough of them. And great support also, great thanks also to our underground storage, which is located in Latvia for gas. And in electricity, we do not have also any problems in supply of electricity. Therefore, actually, we do not want to call current situation as a crisis. We can say that which shows that the market works. Maybe there is a necessity to improve some links in the market model as it works, but actually, we can say that it's a short-term crisis, not a long-term one.
Passion Morningstar, do you share that perspective? Is this is this not a crisis? Is this a blip, or does this spike in prices reflect something more strategically significant?
Well, we'll certainly see if it's a blip or not, it's definitely a pricing crisis at this point. I'm not sure we can say that Russia was the cause of all of these price increases. There are any number of factors that have caused this to happen, and I could get into all of them, but maybe time doesn't permit. But I think it's also true that Russia has the ability to significantly mitigate the crisis by shipping more gas to Europe. Putin has played this quite cleverly. The question whether he's overplayed his hand. He's basically saying, hey, look, we're complying with all of our agreements, and he probably is. But you want more gas coming from us? Well, then get Nord Stream 2 up and going. And also, you see what's happened with spot market prices, and you've thought that was such a great deal. Well, maybe you ought to be thinking more of long-term contracts, which is what Russia, of course, wants. So, So even though Russia may not have been the precipitated the crisis, it certainly could have helped. And by not helping, I would argue that it's using energy as a weapon, as it often does. And I think that what this all emphasizes is the continuing need to reduce dependence on Russian gas. That's where the 3 Cs initiative comes in, because the greater the interconnections, the infrastructure within Central and Eastern Europe, the less dependence there'll be on Russian gas. It also shows why the energy transition is important, and that we need to double down on the energy transition, more and more renewables and other new technologies, because that'll also reduce dependence on Russian energy, on Russian gas. So it is important. Russia's role has certainly not been constructive, and the kinds of things we were talking about today need to be emphasized in order to reduce that dependence.
Before I turn to Dora, I want to turn to the industry's perspective. And Brian, could you share with us your view on this price spike and what it means for Central European energy security and perhaps for the U.S.-European energy relationship?
Thanks, Ian. It's interesting. I think there needs to be kind of a baseline set, and that as we from the industry, we look at global GDP growth is going to grow about 2 times, and that's in 80% of the developing economics. That's going to grow. From European and US side, you're looking at a 20% growth. So what does that look like in terms of needing energy diversity that needs reliable and resilient grids and power? And from our perspective, diversity is going to be the key thing from a security standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint. And as we look about from investments into Central and Eastern Europe, it's building those grids, building those pipelines, building those transmission and distribution systems that allow for diversity, that can create security, not only for consumers, but for the geopolitical side.
So 3 Cs is a great way to kind of expand the diversification of energy sources to Central Europe, perhaps including from the United States. So let me turn to Dora, and that's kind of the big question is, if energy security is important to Central Europe, why should energy security of Central Europe be a transatlantic issue? Why should it be a transatlantic concern? You've operated in both sides of the Atlantic, and so what is the transatlantic significance of this price spike we face today, and more broadly, the need to kind of diversify Central European sources of energy supply, Central European energy resilience?
Thank you, Ian. And first of all, thank you for the invitation, and good morning to everyone in the America, and good afternoon in Central Europe. So traditionally, energy issues in the region have revolved around 3 things: availability, price, and security. And we could see at the very beginning of this year that these things were a little bit overshadowed by the discussion of green transition. But the current energy crisis really did. It highlighted that there are limitations. Limitations because there is still underinvestment in the region. Underinvestment, we were not prepared. And also there is a limitation with the current renewable technologies. So innovation is definitely needed to make Central Europe more resilient and have affordable technologies which can mitigate a situation like this. And I believe like a well-connected energy infrastructure and effective price mechanism can prepare us to be more resilient under any circumstances. And this is where the transatlantic community can step in and improve the energy security of the region. 3 Cs initiative and the fund is a great initiative, but we believe that the projects proposed to this fund should be implemented because so far only a limited number of projects were selected. And unless these projects are implemented, we cannot talk about a more resilient and secure network for Central Eastern Europe.
You know, when we're thinking about energy resilience, a topic of the day has been the transition to renewable energy. And recently in the fall, U.S. Secretary of Energy Granholm hosted a meeting of PTEC, the Partnership in Transatlantic Energy Cooperation. It was held in Warsaw. Many of us were there. And she rolled out a vision for a $23 trillion market for renewable energy-related technology. Aegis, how do you see renewables fitting into the 3 C's mix? Do you see it as renewable energy as an important part of the 3 C's initiative and its energy dimension?
Yes, thank you for the question. Actually, I was lucky that I was in this meeting in PTEC, and I was following it online and looked at all this discussion actually. And I think that the outcome of this meeting, when we added to the PTEC what was previously in the new 1C letter, shows that the climate is common goal for all of us, as well as from the US and as well as here in Europe. And from my perspective, I could say that the green innovative technologies and actually renewables should be one of the core principles of PTEC, and therefore it's included inside. And just also one comment from my side: how can we see this 3 C's initiative and the global cooperation between us? What could be the benefits of it? And I think one important thing is that we both in both sides of the ocean we have the common goals. Actually, we have common goals. We are fighting the climate neutrality. We have decided and we have committed that we will be climate neutrals. In Latvia, in Europe, we see that 2050 will be the deadline. And therefore, I think it's always easier to reach the targets and to look on these innovative technologies and overcome the challenges together, not alone. And I think we can learn from each other a lot. And I think this is a 3 C initiative, and all these events and platforms are a great way how can we share the knowledge from both sides of the ocean. I think it's really good. And the climate, as I said, I think it will be a major part of all this cooperation.
Yeah, Ian, can I add to that comment?
Please, Brian.
And, I was also at that meeting in Warsaw, and Adis and Dora make 2 very important points. I mean, look, I think from the private sector as well as nation states, the commitment coming out of Glasgow, commitment coming out of Paris is a net zero 2050 world. But there is a transition, and we have all agreed, and I mean all agreed, that fossil fuels will phase out. The question is timing of that phase out and the reality of that phase out. So if you take 2020 to 2030, we know that the greatest reduction of emissions comes from fuel switching from coal to gas. The United States alone dropped 1 gigaton in the last 9 years by fuel switching, 1 gigaton of emissions. What we need to do is, as a community, come together, and what is the fastest way to reduce emissions is to do that. Science, data, and technology will dictate the transition from 2030 to 2040 because we don't know what the technologies are going to be available. We can only speculate what those technologies are going to be. And so as we think about from an investment perspective, where can we invest to get the fastest reduction on emissions, but that keeps a reliable and resilient grid that meets those targets? And I think from what Adis and Dora are talking about from the security side, you don't want to do anything that destabilizes your grid and your infrastructure on the sake of betting on a technology that you don't know is not going to work. So I think what was presented at PTEC was exciting, but there is a reality of how we transition in the right way. So I think from just the last comment I would make, the private sector is very excited about what the 3 C's can do and what it can happen in terms from future investments. But we will look to people like Dora and Adis to help us understand what the art of the possible is for their own security and their own reliability.
Ian,
Go ahead, please.
Let me just jump in for a moment. By the way, my internet connection is not very good, so if it starts going bad, I'm going to turn the video off. But in any event, just building on what Brian said, I guess the way I'd look at it is this way. Renewables are critically important, and we have to do everything we can to develop renewables, and that's going to be obviously important from an energy transition standpoint, but also from a dependency standpoint. But renewables are not going to do it alone. There has to be a balanced approach, and that balanced approach includes gas. One of the myths that has come out of this energy crisis is that somehow the energy transition has caused that. That's not true. The energy transition hasn't caused it. But what all this points out is the need for a balanced fuel mix, at least in the short to mid-term, and that includes gas, which is going to continue to be critically important. One of the issues that has to be addressed with respect to Central and Eastern Europe and elsewhere is how are infrastructure projects relating to gas going to be financed? And there are many in Brussels and in other places that say we shouldn't be, there should be no longer any public financing of these kind of projects. I think that is counterproductive. I think we can, in some way, I think we can have it both ways. I think there should be funding of necessary infrastructure projects, but there also can be benchmarks that can be made with respect to that funding. Standards with respect to reducing methane emissions, work on carbon capture, other ways to help decarbonize the process. So again, I would just emphasize, yeah, renewables are critical. We need to, as I said earlier, double down on that. But gas is going to continue to be important, and we have to make every effort to decarbonize gas.
I want to follow on that point because you hit it right on the head. What is the role of gas in the transition? And, it's been very clear that the Biden administration, the German government, when it comes to the 3 Cs initiative and its energy dimension, have been distinctly unenthusiastic about investments into LNG, into gas pipelines, arguing that they are carbon-based and we need to move beyond that. Is that a mistake? Should they be a little bit more open-minded about the role of gas in this transition to a clean, green energy economy? Dora?
Thank you for the question. Yes, for Hungary, we see gas has a role to play as a bridging fuel in the energy transition, because currently there are limitations with the currently existing technologies. And we believe so gas is the lowest carbon fossil fuel. And there are already technologies existing like CCUS that can curb the negative impact of using gas. There should be a business case to apply all these technologies. And besides gas, I would also add nuclear as an important source, which can provide baseload generation. And nuclear has already proved the point being a reliable baseload one. And right now within the European Union, we are talking about taxonomy, and we are debating gas and nuclear. And I believe the current crisis already highlighted like how important it is to have this reliable gas network just to curb like all this, just to mitigate the impact of a crisis like this.
Yes, thank you. I just a few comments from my side on gas issue and what Brian mentioned about this transition from the coal to the gas. Actually, from Latvian perspective, I could say that we are quite green country and we do not use coal at all. Actually, what we use from the fossil fuels is just gas. And anyhow, we have some targets also from European side and in national levels that we need to go to the renewable side. And definitely we see that gas currently is quite a big amount in our energy mix. It's, if I'm correct, it's about 30%. And we as every EU member state, we have developed our national energy and climate plan. And we expect that the consumption of gas will reduce. But anyway, till the 2030, we see that the gas will be quite a big important energy resources in Latvia as well. Because just short statistics in Latvia, if we look on the electricity side, actually more than 52% are produced from renewables in Latvia, and therefore we are quite, I could say, in good shape in renewables. Anyhow, we are looking how to integrate more and more. And I think it's once again, it's important to note what Brian mentioned. I think it's one of the critical side, what we need to take into account if we deploy more and more renewables is the infrastructure, whether it's ready to uptake all this infrastructure, because we should understand that fossil fuels are the I would say the stable energy sources, but if we look on the renewables, they are quite volatile. And whenever the wind will flow in all region, and in the time when there will be no wind, we need to find some balancing generation capacities as well. Therefore, just my opinion, personal, what will be the main base loads fueling for energy resources? I could say that. I think that we still do not know. There is a lot of gap what will be in 2040 and 2050. I think it was good what was mentioned by Brian. We know the main target, we know the aim where to reach, but actually currently I could say that there is no fully available technologies which will be used. Therefore, I think the cleverest thing in this energy sector is to try to look up and try to invest and study up all potential solutions. And I think we are not in the time when we need to exclude something. I think gas should be looked as a good potential. Nuclear was mentioned, and there is some else of different energy sources as well.
Is nuclear power on the 3Cs agenda? And I asked this in part because it was raised here, but also at the PTEC conference in Warsaw, U.S. Secretary of Energy Granholm came in pretty strong, advocating for nuclear power as an important element to Central Europe's energy challenges. Dora, you're nodding. Do you agree with that, or do you see nuclear power becoming a cross-border initiative in the 3Cs region?
I believe nuclear power is already there to support the energy transition, and without having nuclear power in the energy mix, we cannot reach Paris Climate Agreement goals. So I believe we need broader cooperation when it comes to Hungary. We are already started discussion with our neighbors how to take advantage of the decision that we already made about extending our current nuclear capacity, or rather maintaining our current capacity. Because the trends are clear, electrification is on the rise, and we need reliable power. And the reliable power, I mean, when it's always something which is always available. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, and plus we also have this volatility issue that currently there are competing technologies for storage, but we don't have the silver bullet yet. We have hydrogen, we have battery technologies, they're competing with each other, but at this point it will be difficult to predict how the world is going to look like and energy source is going to look like in 2050.
Yeah, Ian, can I just respond to Dora? And I think what Dora said is so important. Diversity of supply, whether it's gas, nuclear, hydro, renewables, are, from an investment standpoint, are vital. And Ada's made the right point that, in the next decade, we know certain technologies are going to be scalable. And Dora, from a business standpoint, hydrogen is probably 20 to 25 years away from being scalable. So what is that interim item that creates that stability of supply to provide from a security standpoint internally and externally? So as we think about how can we be supportive of not only 3Cs, but for support of individual countries in Eastern Europe, it's that thought process of how to build a reliable and resilient grid. And we should be technology agnostic, but we should also be fuel agnostic about what gets us the greatest reduction of emissions the fastest. And, some days nuclear is great for some, and then they turn on it in a second. And then some days gas is great, and then they turn on it. We should be consistent. The goal is to reduce emissions, period. And whatever gets there the fastest should be the goal.
That's the Morningstar. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. To put it bluntly, I think we'd be nuts to ignore nuclear. And I think that it's very positive that 10 EU countries, I believe including Hungary, have signed a letter to the Commission saying that nuclear should be part of the so-called taxonomy, and that it should be part of the equation. Also, I think we need to do a lot of research into new, safer nuclear technologies, small modular reactors, and so forth. And I think the U.S. and Romania have just signed an agreement to work on that together. So it's really important. I think that Brussels, frankly, has taken the easy way out. I mean, what Brussels says about nuclear is, well, we're not going to take any position on nuclear. It's up to the individual countries. But I think it needs more than that. I think it needs a concerted effort on the part of the EU, the US and the EU working together to develop new technologies, to see what can be done with respect to the existing fleet. It's just, from a clean energy standpoint, there's no cleaner energy. So I think this would be very important. Now, whether it should be part of the 3 Cs initiative and whether it'd be like private sector investment or the Amber Fund would ever be part of it, at this point, from a commercial standpoint, I don't know, but we cannot ignore it.
Well, this discussion on nuclear power has triggered some questions. And so let me throw one from the participants that we can't see on the screen right now, but John Gondelski from the State Department asks, I think it's somewhat been addressed, but let's dig in a little deeper. He asks, what is the role of civilian nuclear power in the energy transition, which I assume means civilian versus state-owned? Will it be included among the green fuels that will shape the future of Central European energy? Dora?
So I believe nuclear has a role to play here. It has been there since the 70s, and there are certain countries, namely France, which just decided to build new nuclear reactors. Other countries, including our region, Poland, just decided if it really wants to phase out its coal, it will opt for nuclear. So nuclear power has a role to play. It should be safe. It should be well considered. This is an investment which is costly, but this is an investment which is there to stay for decades. So with careful consideration, with all the circumstances, I believe nuclear has a role to play. And as other technologies are developing, nuclear technology is also developing at the same time.
Here's another question from Pierre Clifton, and he's getting back at a question that I think Brian was addressing. And he asked, where is the balance for Western leaders transitioning from oil and gas to renewables does not create crises or acute shortages, kind of what you were referring to with the wind shortages or when the sun is out. In other words, what is the magic balance between the renewables of today, nuclear power of today and tomorrow, and the existing leveraging of clean gas, so to speak, like LNG and gas-fired electricity generation?
So let me start with that, because that's a great question. Look, if we take climate seriously, and I think your head's in the sand if you're not taking it seriously, is that climate is a global problem. And if we only address this by region or by country, then we are missing the boat here. The goal is to decarbonize, and Dora raised this too, the electrification has to be primary for China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, but you have to do it in a responsible way that allows them to transition in a correct way without hurting them economically and creating energy poverty. So if we're going to tackle this, it has to be tackled with the idea that we need to allow countries to evolve at their own timetable, but in a way that is responsible. So when we think about, Ian, to your point about that balance of renewables with look, Japan, for instance, cannot do renewables in the way that other countries can. They don't have the land, and their continental shelf from a wind perspective falls directly off, from once you get into the water. So you can't put windmills into the water. So each country has their own limitations of what they can and can't do. We have to be cognizant of that. So the goal is to reduce emissions globally, not just in every single little patch around the world. So in my thought process from an investment and globally is, what can we do to allow the transition, as Ada's brought up, this decade, what technology, data, and science allow us to reduce emissions the fastest, what can we do right now from an investment standpoint? And then as we go from 30 to 40, what's that process? So I think Dora's right. Nuclear has to be a component of that. It has to be part of the mix, but it has to allow for a reliable and resilient grid, period. That's the bottom line. If the grid doesn't work, it doesn't matter.
I agree with all of that, Ian and Brian. With respect to the specific question, I don't think you can define balance. I don't think you can say, can put specific numbers on it. I think that what we need to do is to take an all of the above approach and go all out and looking at all of the different possibilities and develop those possibilities in a way that will help reduce emissions and further the energy transition. And what this pricing crisis, going back to that again, shows is that we do need that balance, and we have to be in a situation where, doing as much as we can on renewables, for example, we have to look at the other technologies, and again, getting back to gas, that gas is going to continue to be important. And if we don't consider that balance, then I think we have real potential of damaging the transition, of there being increasing political unrest with respect to the energy transition, that if sectors of society are not getting affordable energy, even with respect to the conversion from coal, which is critical, it has to be a just transition. And I think that is, another point that I think is important, that as we go through this transition, one, it has to be balanced. Two, it has to be just to avoid societal conflict with respect to these issues.
Dora, did you want to add?
Yes, thank you so much. I fully agree with Ambassador Morningstar of the all of the above approach, and we shouldn't exclude technologies which are currently there, because I believe there are two parallel things going on right now. There is only reduction of greenhouse gas emission, like technologies aiming to reduce the emission, and also there is another line, removal of the greenhouse gas from the atmosphere already. At this point, we don't know which one is going to achieve the greater results, but I believe we shouldn't exclude things right now at this point when we don't see what will be the silver bullet by 2050.
Edith? Yes, sorry, I was muted. Actually, yes, a few comments from my side. Actually, if take short on the answer, if there is a magic balance, I think it's quite clear there is no formula one fit all, and that's quite clear. I think every country has their own story and their own starting point, country and region. We can look at also the broader one. And I think what we need to take into account when we are doing this transition, I think that the first main point is it should be done in social economic way, and not to distort our citizens with too much negative impact on, for example, on pricing. And the second one, as I mentioned also previously, I think we should not exclude any technology from the transition. I think that's the main principle. We cannot base our transition only on the one technology. It's not correct way to move forward. I think all technologies should be in place. We need to diverse our energy use of our energy source as much as we can. Of course, taking account the possibilities in each, specifically in each country.
Okay. Let me move the discussion a little bit more back to the broader conception of three C's. Three Cs initiatives all about securing international private sector capital to drive forward infrastructure development. That's a key objective. It's a unique dimension of the three Cs. So turning to my two Central European colleagues first, let me ask you, why should international capital, why should energy companies, for example, like Sempra, be interested in investing and engaging in the three Cs region? What makes it an economic opportunity for international finance? And what is the three Cs doing to elevate that opportunity to make it even more attractive? Perhaps we'll start with Dora.
Ladies first, right? I believe in our region, we need to overcome historical legacy, infrastructure legacy. And three Cs initiative can play a part because we have done a lot in a region to connect all the countries from north to south and south to north. But there are still missing links. And as long as our region is not interlinked and well connected, we cannot be resilient. And of course, it offers a business opportunity for outside partners who are willing to participate. And we should divide these two countries, or these two circle of countries, into two categories. Those who already possess natural resources, for example, Azerbaijan, which has a link to Europe through the Southern Gas Corridor. Yet Central Europe, for example, doesn't have this access to the Southern Gas Corridor because there are still missing infrastructure links. The Bulgaria-Greece interconnector is not done yet. And also there's a missing link between Bulgaria and Serbia. And the second category of countries, I believe, those who could help us with new technologies. We can mention the US with its 17 national lab. We can mention South Korea with its storage industry, or Japan and Germany. They're leading already the way with hydrogen research. So I believe there is plenty of opportunity, but I have a direct experience with dealing with the Amber group. And I believe we should add another criteria when it comes to project selection, national security. Because right now, all the criteria lists bankable projects. But these bankable projects, yes, it's worked for all the companies, but there are also other projects which need to be realized in order to make our region more resilient. And there, the fund could play a role.
Edith, why invest in Central European energy?
Yeah, thank you, Dora. It was, I think it was the main point was mentioned, but I just was thinking what are the additional topics. And, I think one is clear. We have a long-term vision. I think we have committed to the common goal. And I think that the way and the strategy where we are moving, I think it's for stay, and it will be not changed anyhow. We are going that way. And I think for the business society, I think it's a great opportunity for new business opportunities, which have quite important and big economical attractiveness. And I think that is the main point. What also the global companies and investors potential could look on the Central Europe, because as I mentioned, I think we have a long vision. We have committed to that, and we are moving on that way. And I think we provide a lot of potential for any potential investor here. And I think that's the main message here.
Things that I would have also included in that, when you look at the three Cs region, you're talking about 110 million people, $2 trillion in GDP, a growth rate that was 3% annually before COVID, and it's projected to be 3% annually out to 2030 once we get over this crisis. It's a region where energy consumption is increasing. It's an EU environment, so it's a safe place to invest. This is where you go to get long-term safe returns. But let me turn to the market, so to speak, to Brian and also to Dick. And when you think of the three Cs from your perspectives, and Brian, it's from industry, and from Dick, you've been in industry, you've been in government. What does the region need to do? What does three Cs need to do to make their opportunities that much more attractive to foreign direct investment?
So, Thank you, Ian. And, look, I think, Adis and Dora have kind of touched on a couple of things. Look, the first and foremost from an investment standpoint is regulatory certainty, right? That when you walk in the door, what the rules are. And once those rules are in place, the rules don't change. Now, there are, Dora, I'd love for you and Adis to comment. I mean, you have your own rules in Hungary and in the Baltic regions, you have your own rules too, but then you go to Brussels and you have different rules. And so how those two interconnect are very interesting from an investment standpoint. But Ambassador Morningstar raised something too, which I think is very important. And that is the financial investment climate with regard to long-term investments of whether it be nuclear or fossil investments. If the banking community decides what climate risk is and that retards the investments into these countries, that's a bad thing. Because everything that we've talked about of building a reliable and resilient grid is from a transition, it's a long transition. And it's ensuring that the banking community and the financial community continue to understand that climate risk is broad, but it's also very, shallow when it comes to decarbonization. And investments in some of these technologies are going to have to be, we have to be, I don't want to speak too ill of this, but I just want to make sure that we understand what climate risk really is, and doing nothing for the sake of, trying to hope. The hope is not a strategy with technology. So we need to invest in what we know will reduce emissions.
Ambassador Morningstar?
Yeah, I guess I'll say a few things. I think, Brian, your point on banking is really important. And one of the issues I think we have right now is messaging. For example, I think investors are very wary of what the U.S. policy is, for example, with respect to fossil fuels and the role that gas can play, even what's going to happen in the United States with respect to further gas production. And I think that both the U.S. and the EU have to be clear that we're not looking at it from an ideological standpoint. And that, the message is we have to do everything possible with respect to the energy transition, but at the same time, these other things are going to be necessary. I think with respect to 3 Cs, it's important. It's not the only thing that's going to help in Central and Eastern Europe, but it certainly can help. And I think it's going to be important also with respect to these projects that there be public-private partnerships with respect to the projects. There may be many projects that standing on their own don't necessarily entice investors, but with contributions, whether it's EU funding or IFI funding and so on, that can sort of bridge the gap and make projects more appealing to private investors. So I guess I agree with one of the earlier points that in talking about what needs to be done in Central and Eastern Europe, don't just talk about these projects from the standpoint of commercial return and so forth. Look at it in terms, I think we do have to look at what some of the geopolitical consequences are and what's necessary with respect to public participation to make projects more appealing to the private sector.
Thank you. Let me turn to a question that came from the audience, and it's from Zeno V. Broyd. It's a long question, so I'm going to paraphrase, and I hope I do this correctly. He's asking, what is the vision for Ukraine in the 3 Cs, in the 3 Cs energy grid, so to speak? Is 3 Cs actively reaching out to non-EU member states of Central Europe to articulate a vision that will eventually encompass them? And what is the energy dimension that would be part of that vision? Let me turn to Edis.
Thank you for the question. Actually, if we talk about Ukraine, I think we as the Baltic states quite a long time ago was in a similar position. We have done a lot to be really part of European energy system. I think that the 3Cs initiative is a wonderful platform for them to use it. As we discussed previously, there is a lot of potential in this initiative. It's just a couple of them. I will remind it was innovation technologies, development of innovation technologies, knowledge sharing, and it's easier also for them to reach their energy resilience goals. And that was the core principle for Baltic states, what we have done so far. And I think we have quite a common history, and we can also share some views or ways how to move forward. I think the 3Cs initiative is a great opportunity for them to do that.
Dora, do you have a Hungarian perspective on the relationship between Ukraine and 3Cs?
Actually, I wanted to flag another initiative which is complementary to the 3Cs initiative, the PTEC, the Partnership for Transatlantic Energy and Climate Initiative. Ukraine is a member of this initiative, and it specifically aims to help the energy field, like Ukraine's standpoint in the energy. And I believe like there is a role to play for this initiative and also for the 3Cs initiative. And if I remember correctly, Ukraine was mentioned in the German-US statement back from July, that both Germany and US is supporting through projects or to funds to enhance the energy security of Ukraine. And Ukraine could serve as a potential hub for green energy or green hydrogen. But 3Cs initiative countries has a role to play because the market and the transit will go through their territory, or they will be the market.
Let me start closing in on, because we're almost at the end of our time, but on the US relationship with the 3Cs. And in many respects, the US government has been rhetorically very supportive of the initiative. Both the Trump and Biden administrations endorsed the initiative, as has Congress in a bipartisan way. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this panel, the US government has pledged to invest up to $1 billion into 3Cs energy projects, including a $300 million equity investment into the 3Cs fund. So turning to my American friends first, how do you assess US support? Is it robust? What does it need to do between now and, let's say, the Riga summit to further enhance the momentum of the 3Cs initiative?
Yeah, so I'll start, Ian. One, I just want to say, look, I can't stress enough the gratitude that, from our perspective, what Latvia and Hungary have done from a leadership perspective with regard to 3Cs. The regional cooperation there is amazing. It's a great example globally, of how to do things the right way. And so Adis and Dora, I just want to congratulate you both on the leadership that you guys provide to this initiative. From the perspective on this side of the pond, it's, look, I think it's incumbent on US business and, regional North American business to continue to be very vocal with our governments that this is very important. And the more we can continue to show support, I mean, Dora, your point about PTEC, we were there, Semper was there with Secretary Granholm, and I think just showing up, showing support is vital as anything else, that you're there side by side. And so for us, I think, Ian, the bottom line are two things: show up, be visible, and that will also lend credibility that we're showing our government, we in the industry support these efforts and will continue to support them, not only financially, but also vocally as much as we can. But congratulations to Latvia and Hungary for their leadership in this great project.
Let me ask you, I want to push you, Brian, a little bit. I mean, how important is the execution of this commitment by the US government to invest in the 3Cs? Is industry watching that?
Well, 100%. I mean, you have to, there is this, you put your money where your mouth is. If you say this is important, then invest, participate. So we are very much watching this. And, Dora, you made the comment about these efforts. If our government, from a leadership standpoint, sends high-level diplomats and high-level cabinet-level officials and showing that support, that is a clear signal to industry that this is important. And so that's why it is, I think, to your point, Ian, that ability to participate is very important globally to show its importance.
Let me turn to Ambassador Morningstar. Can you build on that point? What should the United States be doing to kind of further add to momentum to the 3 Cs initiative?
Yes, I can build on it. And unfortunately, I missed some of what has been said the last few minutes because my internet connection was up and down during it. But what I take it from what Brian was saying, I fully agree that it's important that the U.S. has to follow through on its commitments, DFC's commitments and its overall $1 billion commitment. It's absolutely critical. We have to put our money where our mouth is if we're going to have credibility, not just with the private sector, but with the countries involved. And, we can't just be in a position, we should be cheerleaders. We should be doing everything that we have been doing with respect to that. PTEC has some great working groups working on specific issues. We should be encouraging and so forth. But if we're going to have credibility, we need to be part of it. It's also going to be important. I think that one of the things we haven't talked about is, again, with respect to dealing with Russian dependency with respect to Russia and what to do in Central and Eastern Europe, Germany has to be part of that as well. And we haven't talked about the joint statement that the U.S. and Germany signed with respect to Nord Stream 2, which includes support for 3 Cs. And a country like Germany should be very much involved in Central and Eastern Europe. But if we can't do what we said we were going to do, how are we going to get Germany and others to go along? So I'm not really saying anything different, but maybe I'm just emphasizing how critical this is.
We have just 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to turn it over to Dora and to Edith and say, maybe if you could give us your perception of U.S. support for 3 Cs, and also close by sharing with us what do you hope to achieve at the Riga summit in 2022, the 3 Cs Riga summit in 2022? And I'll give you about a minute each. Dora and then Edith.
Thank you. So first of all, I just recently visited Washington, and my understanding was that it's still subject to approval to have the US fully committed to the initiative. I just wanted to flag that after the US announced this pledge about a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, many countries followed suit and made pledges and already transferred their contribution. Hungary did that last December by joining the 3 Cs Initiative Fund. And as for the Riga Summit, how we prepare and what we would like to see. We would like to see more projects are being selected. More projects are being selected in a transparable manner. So we can really see the process, and we can see that these projects are actually contributing to not only to the national security, but also to the transition of the region.
Thank you. Edith, you got the last minute. Your pitch for the Riga Summit.
Thank you. I will try to be quite quick, but some key points from my side. Actually, from 3 Cs initiative and the US support, I think it's great that we had such a support. I think it's an example of good transatlantic cooperation. I think it's a wonderful example for all the world, how the 2 different regions can cooperate more. And for us, actually, in Baltic states, I could say that it's a really important platform. And so far we use it to increase our energy resilience here in Baltics. I think it's really important for all of us. And if we talk about the Riga summit, actually it will be a great event here in Riga, and we hope that we will meet you all there. And maybe from topics what will be touched there, I think we will continue to focus on importance of smartly developed energy, transport, and digital pillars. that reinforce a secure and inclusive connectivity of the region's infrastructure and provide solutions. And actually, just once more emphasize what Dora mentioned. I think that's the main point. What we need till the summit in Riga, I think we need to work deeper on all potential projects which could be used and pushed from the 3Cs initiative.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us discussion on the 3Cs initiative and its energy dimension. Thank you, the audience, for tuning in. And I'm now delighted to turn the floor directly over to our next Central Europe Week panel, which will be introduced by my good friend, Jeff Lightfoot, Director for Europe at the Center for International Private Enterprise. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Very nice to see you. Good afternoon for those of you who maybe are just tuning into this session from Europe. Good morning for those of you who are tuning in from North America. And we're delighted for those of you who are sticking around from what was a very interesting and engaging discussion on the 3Cs initiative. For those of you who are dialing in from the Czech Republic and Slovakia, thank you for joining us on an important holiday, and happy Freedom and Democracy Day to each of you. I'm Jeff Lightfoot. As Ian said, I'm the Director of Programs for Europe at the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, one of the core institutes of the United States' National Endowment for Democracy, and have the pleasure of heading up CIPE's New Europe office based in Bratislava, Slovakia, just across town from our partners, friends, and co-hosts here at GlobeSec. I'm also a proud Atlantic Council alumni and a non-resident senior fellow with the Council. On behalf of our co-hosts this morning, the Atlantic Council and GlobeSec, it's an honor to welcome you to today's Central Europe Week discussion on the topic of innovation as a tool for building economic resilience. Just a few weeks ago, this broad theme of innovation and resilience anchored the discussions at the GlobeSec Tatra Summit, which took place in the lovely Tatra Mountains of Slovakia. The conference focused heavily on Central Europe's economic recovery from the pandemic and how the region can take the next step in its economic development to move beyond a manufacturing economy toward an innovation economy. Much of the focus of the conference's panels looked at the imperative of the region to embrace the green transition and to digitize, leveraging historic support and funding from the European Union's Recovery and Resilience Plan to develop a new model of economic prosperity. Also discussed were more technical questions around the reform agenda for the region to create a more welcoming environment for innovation in the region. For example, reforms to the education systems, to healthcare, greater investment in research and development from the public and private sector alike, and the need for greater women's participation in technology to achieve a more innovative economy. For those of you who are interested in a deeper dive of the topic of Central European innovation, I highly recommend that you check out the GlobeSec Tatra Summit's Insight Report, which dives into these issues in quite a bit more detail. And of course, the Atlantic Council's Future Europe Center has some great resources on their site as well. So as we dig into these issues, I'm delighted to introduce a very distinguished panel of leaders from the realm of public policy and the private sector to weigh in on this crucial topic to Central Europe's future. Joining me on the panel are Elena Kutsko, Vice President of GlobeSec and the head of the GlobeSec Policy Institute. Elena oversees policy development, research, and programming in the areas of defense and security, the future of Europe, global order, technologies and society, and strategic communications. We're also honored to have the former Vice Chancellor of Austria, the former Finance Minister of Austria, and the current Chairman of GlobeSec, Wilhelm Molterer. In his long and distinguished career in government and international institutions, he, among other distinguished roles, also served as Minister of Agriculture in Austria and as Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Also joining us is Mr. Paulius Vertelka, the Public Policy Manager at Google, based in Europe. He's a former director of Infobalt and also worked as an expert on improving the investment climate at Invest Lithuania. And last but not least, we have Linda Zelina, founder and CEO of the International Sustainable Finance Center, an apolitical, impact-driven, and technical expertise-led think tank focusing on a range of sustainable finance options headquartered in Prague. So for today's panel, what I'll do is put some opening questions to the panelists to open the conversation and get us going, but we also want to hear questions from you, the audience, as well. You can submit your questions via the dedicated box if you're watching on the Atlantic Council's 2021 Central Europe Week webpage, or by commenting on YouTube and Twitter if you're watching on those platforms. We encourage those of you who are watching along virtually to engage on this topic via social media to use the hashtag Central Europe Week in your tweets about the event. And this event will be on the record and streaming live, but the council will also have a recording of the event on their website. So with all that as a framing and introduction, I'd like to put the first question to Elena Kutsko, who is working with us today on a major national holiday. So kudos to you, affirming your status as certainly a very hard worker in the Slovak think tank sector. And greetings, Elena. You've written a lot about the intersection of security and technology, particularly issues like artificial intelligence and its implications for the transatlantic alliance. This theme, the panel of this theme explicitly links innovation, which I think a lot of people would think about as a purely economic issue, to the theme of resilience, which touches on a range of wider issues like security and even democratic governance. So from your perspective, what's the linkage between innovation and national security, particularly through this concept of resilience? And why is it that so many Central European governments are putting innovation at the heart of their economic and national security strategies?
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you so much, our wonderful partners at the Atlantic Council, for having this event with us today. And indeed, the timing is perfect. I think freedom and democracy is actually very closely tied to our ability to innovate and ensure that in the future we can uphold our values. But thank you also so much for the question. I think the answer here can be rather short. The pandemic definitely taught us to think about national security and resilience in much broader terms and in very interconnected terms. This trend definitely was visible before the pandemic, but COVID-19 in a way finished the job in conceptualizing the thinking and speeding up the implementation of this thinking. When Jeff, you were mentioning that innovation for most people is an issue of economic development and resilience, during the past years, we learned to know that security is now in many ways inseparable from our economic development and our ability to project our prosperity and security in the future as well. So innovation is now closely embedded in both our economic resilience strategies and national security strategies. Central Europe, as other parts of the world, understand very well right now that the extent to which a country is powerful and can dominate or navigate the international global order seems to be inextricably linked to the country's ability to innovate or depends what you can do, adopt emerging technologies. So all countries are currently vying for excellence in technologies that could give them a strategic advantage. And the range of these areas is broader and broader. It starts from everything that relates to communications, energy, artificial intelligence, surveillance, but it currently, especially during the pandemic, extends to medicine, manufacturing, and increasingly to military technologies. We know that NATO is working now on the new strategic concept that would put also innovation at the core, to make sure that we are able to defend ourselves in all domains that start from cybersecurity to our ability to communicate and defend ourselves against the developments and the malign information spread in cyberspace as well. But Central Europe has a very important historical context and hence rather unique internal and external drivers that made sure that innovation is currently at the core of our thinking. Some of these drivers started long before the pandemic, but definitely the pandemic did help us to articulate them and understand them even better. So I will mention two internal and two external drivers. Internally, we know that our economic model is very outdated. And Jeff very masterfully explained the connection and how we try to work on it. But in one sentence, we know that the economic model that we relied upon, that was based on manufacturing and low labor cost, is outdated and the reforms are necessary. And we're running out of time to start implementing this strategy. But the second driver is connected to the role that the private sector plays in the region in terms of the economic development, but also the role that private sector plays in innovation, be it in civilian sector or in security sector. If we look at the Western world today, what we observe is the shift from innovation being done in the public sector to innovation that is being done and driven primarily by the private sector. Central European countries have never been very big on innovating in the public sector. simply because we're pretty small and do not have big budgets to invest in the cutting edge developments or to own the innovation. And so the public sector was not even the leader of integrating the innovation. So from that perspective, the fact that the innovation today is coming from the private sector is a benefit and an advantage for the region that has been reliant on small and medium enterprises to drive its economic development in the past as well. But on the other hand, this is also a vulnerability. Also, although there is some homegrown innovation, it is dwarfed in comparison with innovation that is coming from foreign or multinational companies, and inevitably it adds a little bit of uncertainty about our ability to predict in which direction it will be going in the future. And when it comes to external drivers of putting innovation at the core of security and economic strategies, the first one is the geopolitical competition in the area of technology and digital. The region is very well aware of it, but the region also remembers its history very well. Central Europe has been a geopolitical playground for decades and centuries. And certain scenarios pertaining to technological and global power competition and its implications for the region make the countries here very nervous. For example, let's take Moscow's advances, which are increasingly marked by the manipulation of the digital information space and the use of cyber attacks and spyware. These advances have laid bare our original technological vulnerabilities, but also vulnerabilities in the entire Western world. And the second factor that's again very closely connected to what's been happening in the past years due to COVID-19 pandemic is the disruption in the supply chains in all possible sectors. The region is very deeply embedded in supply chains. That was the key to its prosperity. But now we increasingly see vulnerabilities that are associated with it. We understand better that interdependence, though beneficial, would need to be combined with some kind of diversification to minimize risk. And I will stop here and hope we can elaborate a bit more later.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Elaine. And maybe just to sort of follow up with one question that I think leads nicely or builds nicely upon that in this sort of context of geopolitical competition. My sense was, that COVID was a sort of a wake-up call, but even before that, that the Trump administration, for the shortcomings one could identify of some aspects or critiques of perhaps engagement on the transatlantic side, or that one often hears at least, worked very aggressively with Central Europe as a starting point and within NATO to try to sort of raise awareness around some of the risks of a dependence on Chinese technology. We had seen in Central Europe, the Chinese, particularly Huawei, had made pretty rapid advances and was providing a solution and a set of pricing that was difficult for a lot of Central European governments to say no to as they were attempting to rapidly digitize and build out 4G and later 5G networks. And then the Trump administration sort of helped get some MOUs around a clean path and things like that. And now you're seeing, I think, a lot in the countries in the region trying to walk back that dependency on China. But then you're also seeing some voices within the European Union say that Europe needs to be more autonomous also from the US in terms of data sovereignty and innovation and things like that. How realistic is it from a Central European perspective for Europe to look to develop a robust innovation economy autonomously, breaking some linkages with China or perhaps even being more autonomous from the US? Is that a realistic vision? And might this offer opportunities? The Taiwanese foreign minister was making the rounds through Central Europe about 2 weeks ago, stopping at GlobeSec, if I recall. Does this offer opportunities for Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Israel, other democracies to perhaps fill that void?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Definitely, Central Europe has to look at several important partners that it has. One of them is the European Union, and another one is, of course, the United States. It's the development not just in the region, but it's more a European drive that the EU is trying to develop its own model that would work very closely with the United States, with whom we're aligned in terms of values, and we want to continue working closely together in terms of developing standards that will uphold these values, but also who is a very important security provider. So this vision also penetrates the Central European countries as well. But as you rightly pointed out, there are certain awareness and certain understanding that any potential more autonomous structures in the region will take some time. So the region is not very eager to jump on this ship straight away, simply because it knows that we're now very much dependent on actually both the United States and China in certain areas to be able to afford for ourselves some totally autonomous model. So what the region prefers to see is more incremental developments and, importantly, doing the unfinished business within the European Union, like solidifying our digital single market that would spearhead the economic development in the region as well. When it comes to China, definitely over the past years, there's been increased awareness about the security implications that certain technologies coming from China might have, especially for the region, but also increased awareness about the fact that the Chinese technologies that does not necessarily always come with the embedded standards that are aligned with our values. Plus, exactly because of the pandemic, we now have this awareness that we cannot over-rely on China as the only source of everything that comes through our supply chains. When it comes to the United States, again, United States is the most important security provider for the region, and for Central Europeans, security will be much more important than any trade uncertainties, let's say, with the United States. So definitely the region will prefer to align with the US in the future, also on all things that concern technological developments. That said, there is also a dose of pragmatism in the region. We know that we do rely on the American companies that bring the technological development in the region, that are based in the region, or that operate in the region. And these private partners also key for our technological development as well. So this combination of security concerns plus pragmatic understanding of how much ahead the United States is of Europe in terms of technological development also play its important role in Central European strategies. When it comes to smaller countries, definitely this is an opportunity for the region, and we already see some steps in this direction. And I'm talking here about smaller technologically agile democracies like South Korea, Japan, Israel, or Taiwan. And there are several opportunities here. First, the region knows that it can learn a lot from these countries in terms of developing its economic model. We can learn how to do innovation and technological developments, how to do state-driven mission investments, how to do integration of innovation by agile public and private sector as well. We can learn a lot and exchange thoughts on how to do talent management and the human resources in the area of technology. But this is also important for us from the point of view of this attempt to diversify a little bit from China as the sole source of manufacturing or rare earth materials and so on. While also the region is increasingly interested in working with these small democracies or smaller democracies, is that exactly because they're democracies and we're aligned with them on principles and values and standards, and because they're probably smaller size, there is mutual interest of them to be more closely present in the region and to do business with the region.
Thanks, Elena. I'd like to, you just talked about cooperation with democracies outside the region. I'd like to ask the Vice Chancellor talk a little bit about his vision for greater collaboration among the countries within the region. And Mr. Vice Chancellor, at the GlobSec Tatra Forum, you outlined with a great deal of passion a vision for Danube Tech Valley and the need for greater regional cooperation among the smaller states of Central Europe to strengthen collaboration in some pretty concrete ways that can help foster greater innovation and prosperity in the region. We just heard, Ian Brzezinski and the panelists talk about the 3 Cs initiative, which is somewhat of a different concept with a bit of a different goal. Can you talk about the Danube Tech Valley, the vision behind it, how you think it can foster a greater set of innovative economies in the region, and also how it might exist in complement with other initiatives, perhaps like 3 Cs?
Well, Jeff, you started quite interestingly by saying the pandemic was a wake-up call, but at the same time, you're absolutely right. We have a lot of developments that are even more tricky than the current situation. Is it the issue of climate change? Is it the issue of digitizing economy or society? Is it the issue of aging society? Is it the issue of strategic autonomy? You can name it. And for all of these things, the key issue for me is simply to tackle the challenges in a proper way, is simply make change happen. You cannot continue like we did over the last decades. We need to do it differently, not just better. And this is that's the definition of innovation. And the key issue for me here is in this region specifically, you need to have, first of all, the readiness for innovation and the willingness for innovation. And this means for me that innovation is not an economic concept. It's not a technical concept. It's a real political concept. It's a concept that is an issue for the whole society. That means it's a societal issue and a societal challenge. Innovation is key to make things really happen. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in this region specifically, one of the weaknesses amongst many is we do not have the ecosystem, I would say, in a size that matters for innovation. We need to go cross-border. If you have just national approaches in such small economies, to be quite honest, this makes no sense. Therefore, we need two things. The one is we need way more than two. First of all, we need a strong push for single market initiatives. Because Europe still is, compared to the global players, a small continent. But if you divide this small continent into small pieces, this makes no sense. Single market is one issue. Second issue is regional cooperation, because ecosystems, specifically on innovation, are getting way beyond national borders. And here in Central Europe, we do have exactly this, I would say, Center for Innovation alongside the River Danube. This is something that really matters. You can start from South Germany and go down to the Black Sea and integrate Serbia, and you have really a wonderful ecosystem. If we really overcome these national boundaries and create such an ecosystem, would be great. And the third key element, and this is also something that is driving this Danube Valley idea, is beyond building the network of accelerators, incubators, beyond building the network of research centers, universities, we have to create also a capital market in this region, simply to what Alena had rightly said, to integrate and to invite the private sector. Because this is one of the real challenges in this region. This region has no tradition in integrating the private sector and inviting the private sector to do, let's say, not just business, but also to drive innovation. There is no capital market existing, there is no venture capital market existing really in this region. And therefore, to attract the private sector is the third key element. That means we need this ecosystem on the regional level, we need the strong push from the single market, but we need, as a third key element, the integration of the private sector. And here, to be quite honest, I see one of the current weaknesses. There is so many money flooded into the market from ECB, but also from EU budget, that sometimes for governments it's cheaper to use this money, or it's easier to use this money compared to the invitation to the private sector. And for me, the key issue, therefore, and this Danube Valley could be also a driver for that, is to blend the public sources with the private initiative. And this is, for me, the key element for doing so. Maybe one last sentence. Yes, we need competition, also amongst the global players. That's very true. But on the other hand, we need cooperation. And maybe we should invent a new word that's called co-petition, because this partnership between public and private, this partnership between countries in this Central European region, the partnership also with the transatlantic partners, the partnership with other innovators in the global sphere, like Taiwan, you mentioned. This is for me key. Therefore, yes, competition is okay, cooperation at the same time. Let's co-opt it.
Thanks, Mr. Vice Chancellor. That's a really interesting concept, and I think it really gets to some of the complexity that a lot of the governments in the private sector are really facing and trying to wrestle with some of these macro challenges that you outlined at the outset of your comments. And maybe we can come back to you at some point and talk about the Austrian experience, because in looking at the GlobeSec reporting and data, Austria sort of sits heads and shoulders above the other countries in the region in terms of a lot of the environmental issues that can create an innovative economy. So we might come back to that, but I wanted to sort of pick up on the thread of what you had to say, Mr. Vice Chancellor, and turn to Linda Zelena, because you obviously think a lot about the private sector's role in this, how to actually develop sustainable models of financing, particularly around the two macro themes that stood out at the Tatra Forum was the green transition and the digital transition. From your perspective, in also thinking about this challenge from the Vice Chancellor to create both competition and cooperation, what can be done to advance sustainable growth and innovation, in particular towards transition to a low carbon economy in Central Europe?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to GlobeSec and the Atlantic Council. I think it's a very interesting question. Everywhere you go, especially in the post-COP26 world, you see climate on the agenda and sustainability on the agenda. And one of the greatest questions is also, of course, about innovation. So whether we can leverage innovation to somehow tackle climate crisis and avoid some sort of severe weather events. And I think from our work that we have been doing since maybe a year and a half, we're still quite a new think tank on the scene. But what we've seen is that actually in the Central and Eastern European region, sadly, in terms of the understanding of the issues and their interlinkages, we are maybe about a decade behind. And this is a good wake-up call. We really need to take stock, have a hard look in the mirror, both in the private sector and also in the public sector, and realize that actually we have been slightly asleep at the wheel. This relates to the fact that, for example, when it comes to the EU taxonomy, we have a lot of misunderstandings and problems with the private sector saying this is a big burden. Well, it's not. For example, in this case, the taxonomy is just a dictionary, a list of things that are science-based activities, economic activities that you can undertake without compromising Paris Agreement. Very basic stuff. It's not a to-do list, to invest list. But there's a lot of fear. And I think that number one, that the CE governments could do more proactively, that we would like to see and we advocate for and we work on, is actually to educate and create a better understanding of the opportunity landscape. Because sustainability is not going to go away, and sustainability involves both environment and people. Let's not try and create a division here. It's both. Without the people on board, we're not going to have a transition, but the transition will have to happen one way or another. As I think Vice Chancellor Molterer very well said, we need economies of scale. And this is the direction Europe is going. This is the way all of the world is going. Biden administration has also put actually climate at quite a central role. So finally, what we need to start working on is actually to see sustainability as a key advantage point, a key thing for business models, which can help you guide innovation. Actually, when you look at the data, it's very interesting. There's a McKinsey study that actually shows that a large percentage of best innovations and R&D that has paid off, has improved the bottom line and so on and so forth, is driven by sustainability considerations. So these are companies that made a conscious decision to try and figure out how can they improve their sustainability performance, whether it's social performance or environmental performance. And what did that do? That created savings, and that also created value retention. For example, in real estate, if you start building buildings that have better energy efficiency, well, guess what? You can sell them for better money, and you can also rent them for higher rents. So there's a variety of opportunities that I think we need to focus on, rather than just trying to scare people that this is going to be incredibly expensive. It will be, but see it as an investment. And I mean, I'm Latvian, so I come from the Baltic region originally, but I guess I've worked all across the world. And what I see in the CE is that you have very smart people. We do have these intangible assets that we could leverage better. We also can do a bit of leapfrogging, because if you do a bigger upfront investment, in the long term, you can even calculate these savings. And what people rarely like doing is also calculating the cost of inaction. And this is a real problem for a region that's embedded, as Alena pointed out, in supply chains, because that's going to be the next frontier. Post-COP, everybody's going to start looking at supply chains. Also, we have reporting. So there's big changes in how we need to report. There's going to be European single access point. You have non-financial reporting, SF, RD, and so on and so forth. So we will have big changes there. So that means, guess what? With more transparency will also come a better understanding of risk and bigger pressure to improve environmental performance. So I do think that there's a lot to be done, and I would love to see the CE governments and also private sector actually, to be much more proactive and also look for expertise. So don't be scared. You can also find expertise that's not forbiddingly expensive. And once you actually start thinking and trying to figure out how to navigate this space, you can actually find a lot of help for free or resources for free. So the main thing is just to get started.
Maybe a follow-on question to that I can throw to you and the Vice Chancellor. What we've been seeing here through our work at SIPE in the region is in trying to facilitate better dialogue between municipal governments and the private sector. There's a lot of demand from businesses at the local level, at the municipal level in Central Europe to have a better dialogue with the public sector around these goals. There's big goals set by the European Union, by national governments, and it frankly seems to be there's a lack of transparency sometimes coming. The business doesn't feel like it understands those goals. And then a sense that some of these municipalities and small businesses are poorly prepared for this and are struggling to catch up. Am I right in seeing that gap, and what can be done to help bridge that gap? And I ask you that because of your particular expertise, but also perhaps the Vice Chancellor, because you were a very successful politician and you worked Minister of Agriculture, would have had to have your finger on the pulse of local dynamics politically. So maybe you could take a crack at that question, because I'm actually dialing in this call from Central Slovakia, where the discussions around these big macro issues feel very far from the reality of what people talk about. And it's very conscious to me of bridging that gap between these macro questions around climate transition and, frankly, the economic issues that I hear people talk about when I travel around rural Central Europe. How do you bridge that transition, both with the public sector and the private sector alike?
Well, I would say one of the key things is, do we have a common understanding on sustainability? And I was creating or was contributing to the creation of a political concept in the 80s, mid of the 80s. We called it social economic and ecologic market economy. Because the key question for me is sustainability is based on three pillars. First, economic strength. Second, social, let's say, balance. And third, long-lasting ecologic soundness. And for me, sometimes sustainability is just translated into green. No, it has to be economically successful first. Second, you need, let's say, also technical innovation to achieve the targets. That's not an anti-concept, it's a pro-concept. And what makes it from at least my experience key, we do have in Austria an economic structure where we have a lot of SMEs, specifically mid-caps, and most of them are globally oriented. They have to succeed on the global market. And how can they do it? Simply to be competitive means be innovative. That's the key thing for me. And last but not least, what I would add is, where is one of the weaknesses is the educational system. We have, I would say, pros and cons. We have a system of vocational training, which means we have the entrepreneurial skills and you know, the entrepreneurial approach specifically also for the workers and the skilled people necessary for SMEs. On the level of universities, we are weak. That's an interesting experience for me. And therefore, I would go along the line in saying, okay, how can we incentivize, also including the private sector, into the educational system? Because for me, this is key, even if it is not a quick fix, but in the long term, it's an absolute need. And here we can learn so much also from our transatlantic partners, our Asian partners, that is second to none.
Thanks for that. One of the interesting things that I've talked to in mid-sized cities around Slovakia, they have the further that the cities are from a major university, the less economic development they've seen. There's some really fascinating maps I've seen here in Slovakia where the education system, frankly, took a bit of a beating at the Globsec Tatra Forum is a real area in need for reform. But Linda, maybe I can come back to you on that question of bridging that gap on the climate transition between what you see at the local level and what you see at the national level and the European level. Thoughts on that and how to ensure that the transition is a just one and creates that kind of sustainable social balance that the Vice Chancellor spoke to?
Yeah, I would agree completely about the large disconnect. I think beginning of this year, we ran a series of workshops with actually cities and municipalities on how to issue a green bond. A very practical exercise. And it was very interesting to see how much appetite and interest there is for cities and municipalities to figure out how to navigate this space. And the same on rising interest from business. And I think that the issue here is that, as I think the previous panel also mentioned, what we need is better signaling from the governments that you will have some certainty in terms of regulation. Because currently, sadly, these business models that exist currently are long-term unsustainable, but currently they make sense economically, right? So that's why also the perception that it is very expensive to try and decarbonize. So we have a lot of work to be done there. What I think is very interesting is also the learning process. So education, yes, at Tatra Summit, there was a lot of anger about education systems and the lack of skills that new businesses need. So that goes without saying. We need to improve that. But also, I think what we've seen in other countries. So let's think, let's cast the net wider, not only the US, which is very good at it, but also Sweden and Denmark, for example. The private sector was the one that led the charge. And what we sometimes need is people to come up with solutions. So if you can craft a very clear toolkit or roadmap or something that somebody can use or adapt, that is a very good idea. People like that. They use that. That happened in the case of Denmark with industry. They knew what they needed to decarbonize, so they proposed it. And actually, that eventually got adopted, or at least did get government buy-in. So I think from the business side, I would like people to start becoming a bit more market shapers rather than these rule takers. And that would actually change the equation quite a lot. There is a lack of capacity, and that's one thing that I think we need to work on. And we also need to understand better why people aren't using the opportunities that are there now. So, for example, EU funding. Not everybody is very good at tapping into that. And that's something that we can proactively work on, but that might need a bit more money getting channeled into it and a little bit more concerted effort. So it's not just everybody pulling at their end of the duvet and things not changing in a systemic way.
Thanks, Linda. I'd like to turn now and be very patient. I apologize for taking so long to get to Paulius, a representative here from the government affairs team at Google. I wanted to pull in this private sector voice from US big tech and talk a little bit about your perspective on the region. Google's made some pretty big, splashy investment announcements in Poland, data centers, cloud centers, things like that. We've heard from private sector major companies that this region can be a challenge because as we heard from the Vice Chancellor, it's a series of small countries, and sometimes operating in that market can be difficult for some of the big platforms. What is it that's in particular about Poland? The Polish environment, is it the size and scale of the market? Is it the labor force? Can you talk about what it is that incentivized Google to make these big investments in Poland? And I don't want to put you on the spot, but we did get a question coming in the chat about how others are seeing the Danube Tech Valley. Is this something that you're familiar with from the Google side? So I know you all have engaged in the 3Cs concept, but how does this regional collaborative model appeal to a big US tech platform that's making investments in a fragmented region like Central Europe?
Hi, well, thanks for having me. And well, certainly from Google's perspective, we look at the region on the regional level, right? So first of all, it is much more appealing to see a group of countries working together and see their potential than have a fragmented market from the business perspective. So the Google's investment that you've mentioned in Poland, it's a testament to the perspective that Central Eastern Europe has. It's natural that Google's investments here are driven by the market needs. So we're basically responding to the business opportunities, and those are in fact driven by the tendencies, by the trends that we're seeing in the region. And to illustrate that, I think a couple of years ago, McKinsey did a pretty good research to put a number on the digital economy and its potential in the region. And that number was, I believe, 200 billion euros by 2025, if the region works together and focuses on growing its digital economy. And we at Google, we do see that. We do see that potential. We do see the interest from the governments to work together to create digital single market, to adopt innovative, friendly regulations and policies, and then in turn, creates business opportunities both for us and the companies that we work with. And that's essentially the answer of how come Google starts investing in this region. And we hope to see more of that in the near future.
Well, thanks very much for that. And I remember that McKinsey study. I think the Atlantic Council played a big role in that. I think along with Google and the digital challengers. I think it was that same study, I believe. Is that the same one? Yeah. Maybe a follow-up question to you, and then maybe we can also get Elena's perspective on this.
Exactly.
As a transatlantic, as a big U.S. company investing in Central Europe, where there's a lot of questions about where regulation's going to go, and Elena touched upon some of these themes already. Certainly, there must be quite a bit of interest on the Google side and among other big platforms in the U.S. about the Biden administration's discussions with the EU, the Transatlantic Technology and Trade Council meeting in September, and statements around that. It's good to see these kind of discussions happening, but rather than just siloing and perhaps some harsh words or moving in different directions. But are you optimistic about the tenor of those discussions, and what would a company like Google hope to see emerge from those as a way of spurring greater investment and innovation in the region?
Yes, we are optimistic about that, and we do have quite high hopes for it. In the past, we've seen a lack of such dialogue between EU and US on how the tech regulation or policies should be shaped. And that, of course, did not look promising at all, because we were running in the direction of having a fractured global system that would make business operations really difficult. Whether it's a small business or a big business, it wouldn't really matter. So TTC is definitely a step in the right direction. Now, when it comes to what we would like to see from it, where the list is probably quite lengthy, but some of the key areas where we think that major breakthroughs can be achieved rather quickly are concerning data flows, also data governance agreements, right, between the two economies, competition and platform rules, and how that is enacted on both sides of the Atlantic. So European Union has kicked off working on the alternative competition policy via the Digital Markets Act. Also introduced a revamp of platform rules via Digital Services Act, and all of those ideally should be calibrated between the two regions, so we would end up with a coherent space to innovate and benefit the transatlantic community, and that ultimately rests on common technology standards. For example, the development of artificial intelligence, and what are, for example, the off-limits kind of applications of artificial intelligence, like mass surveillance and things like that. So within the TTC, we do have opportunity to find common ground and develop values-based agreements and rules for the future of tech industry and the community that benefits from it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Elena, maybe welcome your perspective on this as well. Are you optimistic or pessimistic? There's still some pretty significant hurdles despite some of the good vibes and some challenges, just differences of perspective, I think differences of culture. How optimistic are you about this transatlantic dialogue in the technology space? This is sort of my first question to you. And then I think we've also got an interesting question that's come in from the audience that I'd welcome really everybody wrestling with about sort of this intersection between the emergence of new technology and democratic values and how different countries in the region are handling this. But Elena, maybe you can chime in first on your level of optimism or pessimism about the transatlantic dialogue taking place right now on technology and trade issues.
I'm moderately optimistic, probably because I'm in general moderately optimistic about things, but this is a very important development. It's definitely much better than not having dialogue, but I also think that there is important, in a way, ideological convergence on both sides of the Atlantic. There is important understanding that certain things need to be done, both in terms of the regulators having a more important role in trying to sort out what we need to do with the platforms, to sort out what's happening on the platforms, but also in terms of making sure that with all respect to our privacy rights, we are able to work with data and make sure that data is available for companies that want to innovate and that want to use this data. So I think there is a lot that we already have achieved in terms of trying to align a little bit. There are definitely hurdles, but I do think that they're overcomable. This is especially important for the region. Again, going back to what Willy was saying about the importance of regional cooperation, for Slovakia, a country that is mostly a rounding error in most of the budgets of the companies, it is very important to be at the table. And the regional participation at the European level discussion, but also at the transatlantic level of discussion, is also a platform for the region to be heard, to the way for us to express our concerns and maybe our ideas how to structure it in a better way.
And thanks for that. And this is just, we've got about 10 minutes, a little bit more than 10 minutes left. And we got a couple questions that are rolling in from the audience I'd like to turn to, but just a reminder to all of you tuning in, please chime in with those questions. So we got one question coming in online that basically says new technology and AI developments also mean emerging challenges to democracy as well. How are the different countries in the region dealing with these challenges coming from tech, big data, AI? Are countries looking for national solutions on this? I guess I might ask, are they looking for the EU to play a big role? To what degree are they looking to private sector to be a partner in these challenges? To what degree, and I know the private sector, what degree do they look with some skepticism on that? Let me maybe start coming back to you, Elena, and then perhaps Polius in a second, and the others who want to chime in, just please signal me as well, please.
That's a very interesting question because in most cases, at least the first things that come into mind is how the big platforms and big companies are addressing these issues on the intersection of technologies and democracies. And most of these companies are neither located, the headquarters are not in Central Europe, nor are these companies too interested in talking directly to Central European countries that are a little bit too small for them to bother. That's why I think the countries in the region mostly are waiting for the finalization of the European level regulations and then following it to make sure that we're both aligned with the European partners, but also that there is some kind of a bargaining position or a negotiation position vis-a-vis the bigger companies.
I would add, Jeff, if you agree.
Yes, please.
Simply to be rather brutal, I think the time of national solutions is over. If you have global challenges like climate change, and if you have the global dimension of data and the global dimension of digitizing, discussing at the same time national solutions is for me so obviously wrong. And this concept will fail. And one of the key issues, therefore, in the region is, on the one hand, to strengthen the European Union, but on the other hand, to play a positive driving, let's say, attitude within the European Union as a region. And to be quite blunt, also, if the European Union wants to have or to be successful on strategic autonomy, I think we should never accept to be innovation takers We should have the ambition to be innovation makers. And this needs exactly this regional dimension, because for being a driver of innovation, you have to have a size, as I've said. So therefore, I think it's key. We need this regional cooperation. Tech Danube Valley is the model we try. And secondly, we need this absolutely constructive partnership between public and private, because we need each other. Otherwise, we cannot make it.
Absolutely. Public-private collaboration is essential, along with regional collaboration. Linda, I saw your hand up. You'd like to chime in on this question, either on that theme or getting to this theme of sort of the question around sort of how to deal with this intersection of democracy and emerging technologies.
Thank you. I think it's as Elena said, it's actually a very interesting question. I think we do face a problem that while we do have these global challenges, sadly, national regulations and how money flows is still very national. And that plays a really big role. I think that what we need is a much more strategic approach to innovation. Not every country is good on all aspects of different technologies, right? So for example, in Czech Republic, you have a strong industry and innovation around lasers. I mean, that is a competitive advantage. So that's something that might be worth exploring further and supporting more with more financing. In that sense, I think we do have a patchwork of countries and patchwork of approaches. And I don't think necessarily that's a bad thing. We can experiment. And I think that's what people need to become a little bit more comfortable with. We live in a very uncertain world. That uncertainty is not going to go away. But we do need to not put all our eggs in one basket. We do need these different valleys. I love that there's a Danube Valley. There's a Zug Valley in Switzerland that we worked on very early on. We need these different approaches. And let's see, maybe we can create some more interesting businesses or startups, right? You think about Skype, that was Estonia. You think about other ones. It can be done. It has been done before. Maybe let's just learn also from what worked then. How was it financed? And also address these pressures that often force small, interesting startups to sell out to big companies and just become absorbed. Because that is a really big problem with innovation. And I think we can really learn a lot from the past. Maybe we don't learn enough, but I do think that there's already quite interesting things happening. And being in the EU does provide at least some certainty for investors, even if the countries have very different approaches.
Thanks for that. And Paulius, I had seen your hand up before. I assume probably wanting to chime in this question at the intersection of technology and democracy. There is a lot of actually really interesting leadership that we see in the private sector here, actually trying to push back, not just the big platforms, but at smaller entities as well, pushing back on mis and disinformation. So it's really interesting to see the private sector in some cases struggle with this set of issues, but also going back on offense. I wonder if you can just chime in on a perspective from Google on this, what is really a central question right now, and I think in Europe and globally as well.
Definitely. Well, first of all, I would like to make sure that the message gets across, and the fact that I don't think there is a country too small for big companies to talk to about the intersection of technologies and democracy. Yes, it makes it definitely easier to talk to groups, but I think at this important stage, no big company has the luxury of ignoring thoughts and ideas and concerns coming from even the smallest countries. And in fact, at Google, we do engage directly with policymakers that do think about these matters and have thoughts and concerns to share. But at the same time, it's also, I'd like to agree with the Vice Chancellor who said that the time for unilateral kind of decisions is over. And I'd like to just encourage that, yes, like the formats like TTC or the three Cs initiative, forum is a great place to discuss these matters and come up with more multilateral kind of positions and views that we can all agree on, as communities, and find the solutions that work best for everybody.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and we got a really good question from the audience that I think aligns well with everybody's thematic interest in this panel and with the missions of both GlobeSec and the Atlantic Council. And the question is this: we're talking a lot about throughout Central Europe Week about Central European US connections and collaboration during this wider conference. So what more can the US be doing in and around this region to support innovation and investment, with the US being such an important hub of innovation, working together with the public and the private sector in the region? And ask each of the panelists to weigh in on this. We heard just at the last session, Ian Brzezinski talk about the pledges, at least, that the US had made around 3 Cs initiative. We see our ambassador here in Slovakia has made innovation and entrepreneurship a priority. We have these legacy enterprise funds that are really still remain very active in trying to bring budding entrepreneurs to the US. So we see some interesting models of that already. But what more might be done in the future as we sort of close this panel? Let me maybe start with you, Elena, and then we can move on down the line.
I think, Jeff, actually, that you being present in Slovakia as an organization actually is part of what the US can be doing and is already doing. But I want to highlight one more element, and that goes back to our discussion on the human capital and the talent management. What we also try to do within the Danube Tech Valley is to make sure that there's regional collaboration, but also potentially transatlantic collaboration on this aspect. What I mean specifically is partnerships with the research institutions or with the innovation centers across the Atlantic. Already there are some developments. For example, individual universities from the US, including MIT or Harvard, have individual partnerships with the Slovak universities or Austrian universities and so on. But what we're trying to do is to make it more of a systemic manner, where there is platforms for collaborations for people in the region in terms of the R&D, but also educational sector with the American institutions that are done rather systematically and that are very easy to access.
Linda, I wondered if I could get you to chime in next, perhaps looking at this from the sustainable environmental side of this. That's presently a priority from the U.S. administration. I don't know if we know that if it will be in 2 or 3 years, but that's a little bit the back and forth we have in U.S. policy today. How might the U.S. help support greater innovation, perhaps in the climate transition here in Central Europe?
Well, I think just setting it out as one of the strategic priorities would already send a very, very strong signal, because in a lot of these cases, people are trying to see what will be the next big thing. And realistically, how it's all going in terms of mega trends. We have digitalization and we have sustainability and climate. So I think in general, we should be trying to marry the two trends and figure out how do we leverage improved digitalization, which, to be honest, is not still good enough in Central Europe. We have a lot of work to do, and also do talk more and figure out how to do energy transition, because electrification is going to be super important for smart cities, smart grids, smart everything, right? But I think sustainability needs to be that thread that goes through it, because that creates a competitive advantage and you can sell it, and then you rely on hopefully domestically created technologies and businesses, which is a big worry in the region. We don't want to be spending all our money on somebody else's solutions. Maybe we can also help each other and create some local companies that have some additional know-how. But I do think that US and Central European collaboration can yield some very tangible outcomes if it prioritizes things that are future-proof.
Thanks very much, Linda. We're just about 1 minute left, so I wonder if I had just very brief thoughts, if the Vice Chancellor or Polius wanted to weigh in, and then we'll bring this to a close.
Well, I would fully agree on cooperating on research and universities, and I would add 2 elements. The one is multilateralism. US is back on the map. And I find this extremely important, because if you think in the long run, it's about standards, it's about rules on the global level. If Europe and the US is cooperating on this matter, it's key. And another element would be cybersecurity. This is something that matters, specifically also from the aspect of a market-driven economy that's based on democracy. And these 2 issues, multilateralism and cybersecurity, I would add.
I'm going to just stop here and bring this panel to a close, because I know we've gotten to the 5 o'clock hour, so apologies, Polius. But somebody once told me as a moderator, you have one job, and it's to bring things to a close on time. And so I'm going to try to do that in respect for our panelists and our audience. I want to just give a big thank you to Elena, to Polius, to Linda, and to the Vice Chancellor for joining us for a really rich and enlightening discussion that feeds off very nicely from the really rich content that we had at the Tatra Forum. On behalf of the Atlantic Council and GlobeSec, thanks to each of you in the audience for joining. Please stay tuned for additional content in the Atlantic Council Central Europe Week, which will continue tomorrow with a discussion you do not want to miss with the leader of the Hungarian opposition, Peter Markizai, and a discussion around for Central Europe Week around the theme of transatlantic defense. So with that, I will bring this to a close and wish you a good night for those of you here in Europe and a good day for those of you in North America. Thank you and goodbye.